Thank you for joining us for this panel on building resiliency in the beef industry at Ag Emotion Discovery Plus. I'm Lisa Guenther, editor of Canadian Cattlemen magazine. Joining us today are Mary Jo Tait of Celtic Ridge Farms near London, Ontario, Bob Lowe of Bear Trap Feeders at Nanton, Alberta. Bob is also president of the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. Jarrod Gillig, vice president of operations for Cargill in Wichita, Kansas. And Trystan Halpert, director of operations at Shop Steakhouse and Bar in Toronto. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining me. We will move into the opening remarks, and I think for the purposes of this panel, we'll start with Mary Jo today. So, Mary Jo, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Lisa, and thank you, everybody, for organizing this and for giving a lowly person like myself out in southwestern Ontario a chance to participate. So as Lisa said, my name's Mary Jo Tait, and my husband and I own and operate Celtic Ridge Farms. So we are located southwest of London in Ontario, and we have a 100-head cow-calf farm where we finish about 90% of our cattle on our farm, and before COVID-19, we're moving all of those through the wholesale markets directly to restaurants and local markets. Since COVID-19 has hit, we're now focusing more on retail side of things. So that's just a little bit about our business. We also operate an on-farm store where we sell direct to customers. Some of the big things of our business, obviously, is we're birth to beef. So we're working with smaller independent processors right now, kind of located in our area, and then working ourselves to market all of our beef directly to customers. So that's a little bit about us. Some of the biggest things going on in our business right now, obviously, since this COVID-19 has hit, is our business has done a complete 360 pivot. So before everything, we were moving everything, like I said, wholesale, and we lost about 80% of that when everything happened. So we've completely shifted how we're marketing things and how we're trying to make ends meet here on the farm. And yeah, looking forward to the rest of this panel discussion and hearing from everybody else and their perspective in the industry.
Great, thank you, Mary Jo. We'll move into Bob Lowe's presentation, Bob with Bear Trap Feeders and the CCA.
Thanks, Lisa. And as Lisa said, I'm a co-owner of Bear Trap Feeders along with my brother and president of CCA. We're located south of Calgary, Alberta, about 40 miles right next to the foothills. COVID has been kind of a thing that nobody expected, nobody knew how to handle, but it did expose a huge opportunity in my mind for the food system, and that it's created public awareness in the food supply chain. From our business point of view, you know, the biggest threat, and Jarrod can talk to that, is if a packer has to slow down or close in the so-called second wave. That's the biggest immediate threat to our business. What we need going forward, I believe, is to reinforce consumer perception that the food chain is safe and it's there. They aren't going to run out of food. And we also need governments to strategically invest in the agriculture industry, in the cattle industry. And maybe as far as the cattle are concerned, we need some business risk management tools that actually work for the cattle industry. Going forward, I believe we'll come out of here shining. We're producing protein in a protein deficient world, and that's always a good thing. We plan on expanding, you know, rigorously expanding to bring more family in. And we would like to be prosperous based on the markets. What resiliency to me in the feedlot industry looks like is we'd like to have some BRMs that actually work for the cattle industry on the shelf and funded, so you don't need to go through a whole bunch of different learning, teaching new politicians and things what needs to happen. And so, you know, something comes up, you just grab something and in it goes. The way that that's going to work is we need our customers and the general public aware of the supply chain and be ready to defend it. And to me, that's our number one job going into the future, is when 2% of us feed the other 98%, it's pretty hard for them to have a handle on things. And we need the other 98% of the population to take ownership of the food industry. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Lisa.
So next up, we have Jarrod Gillig, Vice President of Operations for Cargill. Floor is yours, Jarrod.
Thanks, Lisa. Good morning. I'm joining you as I look at the other backgrounds and offices. I'm sitting in a hotel. Our family shows Hereford cattle, and we're at the Junior Hereford show. So I stole a little time here in our hotel room. So apologize if it gets a little bit loud or awkward here. But again, thanks for the opportunity. You know, as we start the conversation this morning, I definitely agree. I think it'll be a great conversation, and looking forward to hearing everybody's perspective. You know, I want to take a little bit of time and look backwards, though. I think you know, as we think of going through COVID-19 and really what the industry faced, you think of the essential workers, and it's the entire supply chain as we look at that. So first and foremost, I want to thank the ranchers and farmers across Canada for what they have done to keep that supply chain going. As Bob mentioned, it has been a challenge. You know, we had a facility that we did have to slow down, and we've learned a lot. You know, as we went into this, I don't know that any of us expected exactly what we were going to find out, or what we were going to see, or what we were going to get faced with. And I'm really proud of our employees. I'm really proud of the teams across Canada that have helped to maintain and continue to supply protein across, and beef specifically, across Canada. So first and foremost, thanks for that. You know, as we think of, you know, what does it look like for the next 6 months, and what are we doing different? You know, across our facilities early on, I mean, going back through early March, we were able to learn a little bit from, you know, Cargill's footprint across the world, right? So as we thought and we looked at other places that faced this first, we were able to implement things a little bit faster. And so we started, you know, temperature taking. We started, you know, doing questions on how folks were feeling. We started doing barriers, and, you know, as we all recognized, there was an opportunity getting masks. And if you think of the number of employees we have, and making sure everybody's got a mask, that was probably the one thing we'd say, if we could do something different, it's how would we have available supply of that more readily available in an event like this, to where we could get it, because we consider that being, and, you know, we were reaching across the world trying to figure out how to get it. We're about 30 days late in that. And obviously, you know, Alberta Health or Ontario, as we were going through that, it kind of went back and forth on, do we need masks or not need masks? And so when we were able to get them, I think that was a huge shift for us, and something that was really positive. But, you know, we continue to look across this next 6 months. We're doing some expansions in our High River, Alberta facility to help, you know, in our commons area to separate people. We've spent a lot of time in our Guelph, Ontario facility doing separations in hallways and just the commons areas, you know, trying to figure out how do we take that social distancing to another level from where we are. That, you know, looking a year ago, we would have never thought of that, right? And we take a lot of pride in our team and the family orientation to that, right? I mean, there's some great employees that have been there since we started the High River facility, and you know, 30 and 40-year employees at our Guelph facility. So it truly is something that we're really proud of with that group. And so you know, several things as we look forward. It's positioning. You know, Bob mentioned the next wave, and that is a concern. So how do we position ourselves to make sure we keep our team safe, continue to educate them, and that's a lot of what we're doing is really that education about, hey, you know, in the community, we still need to be vigilant and making sure what we're doing in the facility, how do we take that home, whether it be social distancing, you know, mask wearing, et cetera. You know, across the next 5 years, I think it'll be interesting. And as we went through COVID-19, you know, we talked a little bit, or, you know, it was kind of mentioned the movement from food service to retail. And that's what we saw too, right? I mean, and we'll hear here in a second about what that means for the food service business. But as we think of that, the expansion or the changes in the food service, I think that'll come back up to us to figure out how do we better service them. If there are different cuts of meat, are there different preparation that they're utilizing that we can help them with? And then from a retail space, how do we shift some of our capacities more readily available for that retail space to make sure that we've got product flowing? And I think that's an important part of it. And then, like Bob mentioned, it's setting ourselves up so we don't have that disruption. And that is what Cargill is highly focused on as we continue to look at the expansions, like I mentioned, in our cafeteria and locker rooms that we're specifically doing there in our High River, Alberta facility. From a resiliency, I really like Bob's mention on education and how do we make sure, the consumers understand the entire supply chain. As I mentioned, the farmers and ranchers, they're as essential part of this as the chefs in the back of the chop house, right? It takes the entire process through to make our systems flow, and I think that is absolutely critical. So, as I think it's resiliency, it is that the ability to make sure we're educating and communicating with the team or with the broader Canada, across Canada, and then the importance of our team. So. Really proud of the industry and what we've done. I recognize it's been painful, and but sure appreciate the opportunity and look forward to the discussion this morning.
Great, thank you so much for those remarks, Jarrod. And finally, we're moving on to Trystan Halpert at Chop Steakhouse. The floor is yours, Trystan.
Thanks, Lisa, and good morning to everybody else. I'm happy to speak in front of this panel today and hope to share some information about what's going on in the restaurant industry in Canada. So first off, I'm happy to announce that as of last Thursday, Chop Steakhouse has opened all of its locations Canada-wide in some form of different fashion. In Ontario specifically, we're stuck with patio dining for the time being, hopefully to be announced that there'll be a change later on today. But out in Western Canada, we've been allowed to allow guests join us for inside dining, which is great and helping us get as close to back to the new normal as possible. So, when I think about the biggest risks in our industry, a few things come to mind. Number one is just the sheer ability to serve lots of guests. In each one of our provinces in Western Canada, we're limited by capacity, and that's changing. Feels like almost every day there's a new announcement about a proposed mandate or something that's coming into play. But at most of our locations, continuing trends with the rest of the restaurant industry, you can safely say that restaurants are open at about a 50% capacity. In some provinces, you're allowed to go above and beyond 50% capacity if social distancing measures are in place, whether that's distance between the table or some sort of barricade, shield, plexiglass, or glass in between tables where you can't remove a booth or you can't prevent someone from being 6 feet away from each other. Public fear also ties into that. As we've been open at some of our locations for roughly 6 weeks now in Western Canada, we're starting to see some of the people come and dine with us that forewent the first 4 weeks or 5 weeks of us being open because they were just scared, and they were scared of what leaving their house would look like, what visiting a restaurant or a retail store or a movie theater or a convention center would do to their health, and whether they were in the high risk group or they just simply were scared because of all the media out there. We've lost a large chunk of our guests due to that, and only now are we starting to see them come back. The second piece about risk is the constant need to develop new health and safety protocols. So I can tell you from our experience, and this is mimicked at other Canadian restaurants, it was weeks and weeks, if not months, of data collection, research from the United States, research from different continents to create what we would call our COVID-19 playbook that has hundreds of new things that we must do, whether they're mandated by law or whether they're a best practice across the world, to make sure that we can assist in flattening the curve as we bring our teams and our guests back to work. So that's been quite challenging, and it's ever changing. So it's almost a full-time job to keep track of what's new in the news and what's being mandated by local health regions across the country. And then the last risk before I talk about some opportunities, because I'd love to talk about some opportunities too, is there's been a lack of a cost structure change in Canada as we've continued to reopen our restaurants. So although we're reopening our restaurants and we're mitigated to a reduced capacity, we are continuing to spend high amounts of money on PPE, new chemicals, masks, face shields, gloves, all of those things that are helping protect our teams and our guests, which is the right thing to do. And we can't willfully pass that cost on to the guests. So in some of the provinces across the country, there's been a reduction in the cost structure for alcohol or paper products. And in most of Canada, it's remained at flat, which has been tough as we've been able to only serve a percentage of our guests coming back in our restaurants. As we all know, the profit percentage in restaurants is quite low. So every additional cost associated with paying for something new is costly, and it's detrimental to our profit and loss statement. So here's some opportunities, and here's what I've really enjoyed about COVID-19, if you can use those two words together, enjoying COVID-19, is we've moved faster than we've ever moved before when reinventing what we do for our guests and for our teams. Previous to COVID-19, I'll use an example of food development. It was about a year-long process before we were able to get a new menu item onto our menu. That started with an extenuous taste panel. It went to market test. It went to final purchasing and contract sign-off. And then sometime at our next scheduled staggered rollout date, we would roll it out. In COVID-19, we're just taking risks, and we're doing what we think is right for the market, right for our guests, and right for our team. So we've moved faster than we've ever moved before on things like new steaks and new steak options, new beverage and new beverage options, new cocktail menus, rolling things out to the Canadian public from a health and safety or from a standard point of view that haven't been tested, but we believe in our hearts that that's the right thing to do. So I've really enjoyed cutting the testing process down to almost nothing and just doing what we think is right. We've been able to take more risks. We've been able to do more promotions. We've been able to try to find our niche in the market and make sure that we can get our unfair share of guest count, which is obviously important in a world where less guests are wanting to come to our restaurants. And we've had to make some tough decisions, but they're tough decisions that in the past would have been a lengthy process. And now it's a quick phone call with a group of multi-unit leaders from across the country to decide whether or not, for example, a menu item gets deleted, or a system that we subscribe to that doesn't show great value to us gets deleted or changed or altered, to make sure that we're spending our money wisely, which is extremely important these days. Even for a large company like Chop Steakhouse, which is part of a parent company out of Vancouver Northland Properties, which is one of Canada's largest hospitality group, we're making the same decisions that people have made at little independent restaurants or at farms like Mary Jo's Farm. We've had to adapt to the new conditions of Canada and make some really tough decisions. What's our business going to look like in 5 years? Well, I hope we'll be getting back to normal, if not already back to normal. And our version of normal is simply this. We believe that restaurants are a great avenue to come and forget everything else around you, which is why our restaurants have been quite busy throughout COVID as we've been allowed to reopen. Is we believe that from the moment you step foot onto one of our patios in Ontario or into one of our lounges or dining rooms out west, we want to do whatever we can to make your worries go away, whether that's through a great cocktail, a glass of beer, great steak that you can certainly get at home, but you can't cook it the way the Chop Steakhouse cooks it. We want people to just come in and leave happier than they did when they came in. And so far we've been able to hit that goal. And I think a lot of restaurants in Canada have been able to hit that goal and have guests a little bit happier when they leave versus when they came in. We still want people to visit restaurants, and we don't believe that just because of COVID-19 that things are going to change dramatically. There's been lots of discussions about automated ordering services and robot servers and bartenders and reducing your workforce to try to increase your health and safety amongst your team and your guests. And at Chop Steakhouse, we truly just want to get back to normal as soon as possible, whatever that new normal is, and keep up with great hospitality and serving great food across Canada. And a more resilient beef industry, to me and to our company, a more resilient beef industry looks like more transparency to the Canadian consumer. So now more than ever before, in our opinion, people are wanting to purchase local, whether it's as local as within 100 miles or as local as within Canada. And there's more of a want and a need to support our Canadian friends and fellow colleagues and their small businesses to make sure that we can keep the economy alive. More than ever before have we been getting asked questions about where our food comes from. And at CHOP, we're really lucky because all of our steak is, and prime rib is 100% Canadian source. So that's a statement that not a lot of our competitors can make across the country. And we believe that that'll give us the added advantage of increasing our guest count and our guest experience throughout Canada. And also just feeling good about supporting people like the Tait Family, which is one of thousands of small producers in Canada. And when you tell the story about Canadian beef, it's quite eye-opening for many Canadian consumers that don't know the background. So telling the story and creating a greater transparency from truly farm to table is what we think is very important to build strong resiliency. And then, to Jarrod's point about Cargill and some of the larger producers out there, given that there's a ton of producers in Canada, and there's very few packers. When one or many of our packers experience a downturn in business due to something that happened through COVID-19 or a health and safety scare, that really does affect the Canadian beef industry from a restaurant perspective, and sometimes may put a hold on the supply chain moving forward into retail and restaurants. So I'm not suggesting that we increase our the number of packers in Canada by triple or quadruple, but I do think that there's a power in increasing the number of packers and cutters so that there's more opportunity to continue moving strong on that supply chain throughout the country. And that's really it for me. So I'm looking forward to the rest of this call and happy to answer any other questions moving forward. So back to you, Lisa.
Great, thank you so much, Trystan. So we'll move into our discussion questions, and I think we'll just work our way backwards. So Trystan, you did touch on what a more resilient beef industry would look like, as well as some of the things that might go into building that. But do you have more thoughts on what needs to happen to make the whole supply chain more resilient, or?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts and opinions that are shared amongst people in our company. I guess the first one, like I said before, is transparency about where our Canadian beef comes from. That is ultra important to the Canadian consumer, and people already know that Canada beef is excellent, and we just need to tell a better story. And I think that starts from collaborating with the producers, the packers, the cutters, and the restaurants at the same level, which for our company only started about a couple of years ago. It was very much a restaurant and cutter relationship. And since we've expanded into becoming closer with our producers and packers across the country, not only have we learned a ton from them, they've learned a ton from us. And it's been a really great relationship building tool, and has resulted in things like continuing on the way to sustainable Canadian beef through the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and partnering with companies like that are truly trying to move the needle and get more Canadian beef sold in Canada. I don't know what the current percentages of how much of Canada's beef is sold within Canada, but the last time I heard a figure, it was quite low, or surprisingly low anyways, and making sure that we can support our fellow farmers. So that would be number one for me. Number two, I think, is all about continuing on this path to sustainability. So the words sustainable are very important to a consumer in a restaurant. Those terms have been thrown around loosely in the past, and we're partnering with the CRSB to make sure that we can assist in whichever way we can to continue on the path of sustainable beef. We really believe that that's very important in Canada, and given that there's thousands of producers, it will be a long journey, but to be able to put that on a sticker in a retail outlet or on a menu in a restaurant outlet will help move the needle for Canadian beef purchasing and hence consumption amongst Canadian eaters. So those are the two things that are really important to us, and really just going back to relationship building. Whether it's with large packers like Cargill or producers like the Tait Family Farm, there's nothing that we don't want to do to get our relationships better in those industries. And I think the goal should be in Canada that eventually there's a much closer relationship between all parties to strive towards the same goal, because without great producers, we can't sell great beef. And without great restaurants and great knowledge, the beef wouldn't sell. So it's a revolving door of continued great relationships into making sure that we can push as much Canadian beef through as possible in this country and in other countries as well.
Great, thank you so much, Trystan. So Jarrod, if you could weigh in on what you see needing to happen to build more resiliency, just from your point of view, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. Can you hear me? I've got quite a bit of stack on mine. Yeah, so from, as Trystan mentioned, I think the work with the Roundtable of Sustainable Beef is paramount. I mean, as you listen to what Canadian consumers want across Canada, that definitely is something that comes back to us to say, hey, how do we get a more sustainable system? What is that, and what does that entail, right? So it's more than just it's talking about it. It's literally going from pasture to plate to figure out what does that look like. So I do think that's an important piece of it. As we think of from a supply standpoint and the capacity issues, I mean, some of the conversation there, particularly as we think of our eastern producers, I mean, there is an opportunity, and Cargill continues to evaluate that. Obviously, our model is larger in scale. We are proud of what we do for the Canadian producers, being able to provide beef to the consumers and create that point of connection between the two. As I mentioned earlier, I think the education, what we can do for our consumers about Canadian beef and just Canadian ag in general, and continue to do that. I know the CCA does some outstanding work, going back into the farms, right, with the videos and really thinking of how do we create that connection back. So I think all of that work is very important, and we've got to continue to tie back, that connection to how the entire process works, and making sure that folks understand what it takes to get the steak on their plate when they go to chop, or when they go into a retail store and see that loaf of ground beef there. Then the other piece is, as we think of facing through COVID-19 and the pandemic, it's really understanding in the future state, as we're faced with different challenges, how do we come together faster and make sure to add that, and that will create resiliency, right? As we create those connections and learnings. I mean, we've learned a lot. Trystan talked about, from a consumer standpoint, how do we make sure that they're confident going back into stores? I mean, it's no different than from an employee standpoint. As we work with our employees, how do we make sure they're confident coming into work so that we can continue to maintain and look at that supply chain? We're proud to be 100% across, back to capacity, and trying to figure out how obviously to maintain that and see into the future to figure that out quicker. I think we have learned a lot, and I think we've positioned ourselves very well for that moving forward.
So Bob, from your point of view, what do you see needing to happen to make the industry more resilient?
I'd like to thank Trystan first for allowing people in Calgary to eat inside the restaurants, because this summer is not conducive to eating on patios, as anybody out here will be able to tell you. And you mentioned a more resilient beef industry, be more transparent, and you're absolutely right. Transparent both to the customers, to the consumers, but also more transparent and more communication along the beef supply chain, from you right down to the cow-calf producer. And we need everybody. The Mrs. Tait's farm is a great example of pasture to plate marketing, but we also need the big guys in there, the Cargills and the 20 and 50,000 head feedlots, to get the product to the general masses more efficiently and cheaper. They're just You know, the reason you go to the grocery store and buy meat at a very competitive price is because of the efficiencies in size. I think the resiliency, to me, the number one thing that's going to make the beef industry and all of agriculture more resilient in the years to come is, and I mentioned it before, is if the general public can take a little bit of ownership of it and become proud in our food chain, if that happens, if we can get that and the education to go behind that, if we can get that to happen, automatically that makes the whole thing more resilient to things like COVID in the future. People trust it and have confidence in it, then it will continue to exist.
Great, thank you so much, Bob. And so finally, Mary Jo, just from your point of view, what do you see needing to happen to build that resiliency that we need, especially these days in the industry?
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks everybody. I've really enjoyed hearing all the different perspectives and definitely share a lot of those perspectives. So as Bob said, we are a much smaller operation, and so we work on the pasture to plate, you know, straight to consumer and that sort of thing. And that requires a lot of our own marketing, something that is a full-time job for us from the moment we're up until the moment we go to bed, and sometimes in the middle of the night when the phone dings and somebody has a question. So not all farmers can have the opportunity to do that. What we want to be able to do is raise a livestock. That's why we got into this. We love raising cattle, and that's what we want to do. And we love sharing that with people as well. But it is a whole other job on top of just trying to do a great job of raising our cattle. And that's why when things like the Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and more specifically for us here in Ontario, we're starting to look, we're actually registered with Verified Beef Production Plus, and those types of programs are something that helps put that kind of paperwork side behind it for the consumer. But what we learned in our small business is that a lot of people, that doesn't, you know, saying having that logo or having that attached to our farm sign at the end of the road didn't necessarily give them that understanding of what that actually meant. So it still relied on telling that story. So as everyone has kind of echoed, if we can expand that throughout the entire chain and having everyone understand what that means, and at the end of the day, if a consumer looks at it, much like they do, you know, for other ag commodities, and seeing a stamp and recognizing this is what this means and this is what the value is behind it, that to me is a resilient food chain. Because why we do what we do, which is, you know, a lot on our own part of trying to market our own beef and working with a small independent processor, is because we are fairly young in this game, and it's very difficult financially to start out, and it's very difficult to continue to stay in this, especially with the percentage that we lose, you know, to our local independent abattoir and then to a market, and trying to move it ourselves. Our margins become very small, and it becomes very hard to pay bills. So if we, through this COVID, what we have seen is we've gained a lot of new customers who before were just looking for, you know, the lowest price and not looking at country of origin. And now they're starting to realize, you know, I can rely on my local farmers and my local grocery store and those types of things because they have great product. And so that's been really positive. And in my opinion, I hope that continues. I don't have a specific opinion on whether we need lots of large processors and lots of small. I think it's great to have a great mix of both, and continue to be able to provide beef at a competitive price, and it's an excellent product. And then you can also still go to your local abattoir or farmer and get the same great Canadian beef. So my hope is that through all of this, Canadians realize, or at least the ones that I'm working with in our area have realized, that the farmers are there for you. And they're starting to see that throughout the chain all the way and to someone like Trystan and Chop, and supporting their locals. So in my opinion, that's what I hope is all going to come out of this, amidst all of our regular farming everyday struggles, and the positivity that's come from people supporting Canadians.
Thanks so much, Mary Jo. It's so good to hear from a young producer on this, as well, as I'm sure it's very challenging, as it is for many businesses, right? So I think we'll start with Bob. Bob, you touched on this a little bit, but do you have more thoughts on the roles that either the beef industry, beef producers, government, or the public can play in building that resiliency that we need in the beef supply chain?
Sure, and in a nutshell, it's communication. And as Trystan said, transparency. Within the supply chain, the customers, the consumers, they actually have a responsibility in this, and that is to learn and to read and to evaluate the science of what's good and what's bad. I mean, there's everything from nuts to bolts out there, and it's up to individuals to take on the responsibility of learning. And I think we can compete very well if people listen to if people make up their own minds. Government's role in this whole thing is to acknowledge the importance of agriculture in the Canadian, in Canada's economy. We've been so long since there's been any threat of, scarcity of food or food security that the public has gotten complacent, which leads governments to become complacent. Agriculture is right behind energy as the #1 contributor to Canada's gross domestic product. But it doesn't seem that way when you start dealing with governments about it. Whether they think that or not, I don't know, but it doesn't seem that way. So they have to be ready to listen to industry and do what we're suggesting, which is, little times of COVID was a really good one. And of course, nobody knew, because nothing like this has ever happened, at least as many lifetimes as I can think back. But a little bit of strategic investment at the right time goes a long ways. It's not that we need to have beef in the marketing board or anything, but a little strategic investment goes a long ways. And I do believe that will come to government once the public is made aware and confident in the food system and in the beef system. I read an article this morning that said, actually, I forget the percentages, but a vast majority of the public thinks that government should maybe do a little bit more when it comes to the ag industry. So that's kind of in a nutshell. Everybody has a responsibility, but it mostly falls on us in the beef industry to become completely transparent, because we have to build the trust in the system, and unless we're transparent, we can't do that.
Great, thank you so much, Bob. Yeah, that's transparency is coming, and communication is coming up a lot in these discussions today. So Mary Jo, do you have any thoughts on whether it's government, the public, or the beef industry, what specific roles they can play in building up that resiliency?
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. Much like Bob, I think everybody has a role in that. I can't help but, as a young producer, and as, even though I grew up on a farm and had farming parents and 5 farming in-laws, looking at what priority the government does place on food production and food production in Canada. And to make a really simple, not comparison, we look at how things were back in the days, and we're seeing a lot of folks trying to move back towards that, is producing enough for what I need and then producing a little bit more and whatnot. And I'd like to see the government put a focus on producing what we need for us here in Canada first, and having our Canadian consumers be able to have that option first before, exporting and whatnot is important as well. But I'd like to see that come forward first. And I'd like to see that come from government, and also in their support of producers and keeping us involved and helping us, because it's pretty hard when you look at that bottom line and, working out the fine details of being able to make the next mortgage payment on the farm, month by month, especially when it comes to a global pandemic. It can sure make you pretty uneasy in a already risky situation. So that's kind of what I'd like to see from government. For producers, I think we're all trying, and I think we're doing a great job of trying to tell our story but a lot of us, our main goal is to get up in the morning and feed cattle. So there's been some great work, especially done by organizations in my area, by the Beef Farmers of Ontario and then CCA as well, to try and help us tell those stories. And I think that's great. And I'm glad when the public asks questions, standing out in front of farmers markets and that sort of thing. it's surprising. A lot of folks who are asking about beef, they're not even sure what cut they may have been buying at the store. They were just buying whatever was on sale and wherever it came from. So I think there is some responsibility on all parties. And when all parties are working well together and communicating, then I think that's going to lead to a stronger industry as a whole. Thanks.
So Jarrod, do you want to weigh in on what roles, whether it's the beef industry, consumers, or the public or government, can play in building more resiliency within the supply chain?
Yeah, you bet. You know, the conversation there around communication, I think that's spot on, but I'd take it even a step further, right? I mean, it requires collaboration. And as we think of the alignment from a food safety standpoint, being food security, and even going back into COVID-19, right? And not focusing solely on that, but as you really think of the collaboration and some of the examples we've talked about, I think that is absolutely critical. And obviously the opportunity to share experiences and understanding best practices, you know, from a safety or food safety aspect, as Cargill looks across North America, we do share best practices and think it's absolutely critical, right? So whether it be from a smaller abattoir all the way into one of our facilities with the larger facilities, how do we make sure we're learning? I mean, we talked about the additional costs, you know, Trystan talked about the additional chemical costs. We're all facing these additional costs. So what's the most effective method? How do we make sure that we can keep our team safe, but also how do we make sure that we keep our product flowing, you know, through to the consumers there in Canada? You know, working with the government on food safety systems, I think the evolution of that and how we look at that, I think that is a critical role. You know, from an education, obviously with our health services, whether it be Alberta or Ontario, going through and how we address that, and making sure that the education of what that looks like, why we're facing this type of pandemic, right? And as Bob said, nobody's ever seen this before. So we are learning, you know, at a breakneck speed. But again, that's where the collaboration comes in. You know, from a public standpoint, I talked a little bit about the education back into consumers. But, you know, there's an opportunity to truly explain the complexity. I mean, whether it be with the Tait Family Farm, I mean, it's a complex system, you know, to get it from the gate to the plate. And then you go through one of the larger facilities and the feed yards, as Bob mentioned. I mean, there's just a lot of steps. And I think it's the continuing, making sure we have that education from a point to point throughout that entire thing. And then, you know, as protein producers, how do we continue to be more proactive? And I think, you know, obviously conversations like this is a huge part of it, but it's really looking forward and looking around, you know, the world, as we think of trade and you think of what's going on in news, I mean, it becomes a pretty small place. So how do we accelerate our learning from other parts of the world and truly bring that back to Canada so we can better serve our consumers and make sure that, you know, to Trystan's point, it's that local, it's that confidence of, hey, this is Canadian beef and it's great beef, and make sure we continue to market and educate our consumers to that.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it's amazing how quickly people have had to learn in this pandemic. Like, I just sometimes still, when I think of the massive change that has went through the whole supply chain, it's quite astounding.
It is amazing. Yeah. I agree.
So Trystan, do you have any thoughts on this question on what different roles people can play in building up that resiliency?
Yeah, I've got 2 quick points, but I echo what Bob, Jarrod, and Mary Jo have all said. They stole my speaker notes, so I'll be left with not too much. I want to talk about public perception and public education, because I think that's truly important. And me not working directly inside of the beef industry or in the government, I have got a lack of words or opinions for that. But what I do know is that as a consumer in Canada, knowledge is key. And 2 things that make me feel very good about Canadian beef are, number one, before this meeting, I visited Celtic Ridge Farm's website, and the first thing that you see is a family, and it's Mary Jo and her husband and her two young children. And I think that the public perception of beef in general, maybe because of bad Netflix documentaries or incorrect public perception, is these massive, massive farms with tens of thousands of animals, congregated together in cages or in small pens. And it's not true. I don't know what the exact number of head per farm on average there is in Canada, but I know it's certainly not in the tens of thousands like some may perceive. So I think getting back to, grassroots on how small the industry really is and how this industry is created by many small producers is key. And then sharing marketing, whether it's through national brands like CHOP or McDonald's would be a great example. They recently published a commercial regarding Canadian beef and their usage of Canadian beef. And you watch the commercial and you feel really good about the Canadian beef industry, and you get closer connected with how important it is from a Canadian economic perspective. So knowledge marketing should equal education, and should then, in turn, create a little bit more excitement about that in the Canadian market. So that's all I have to add about that. I thought everyone else made very good points.
Great, thanks, Trystan. So to give you a chance, we'll start with you on this next question. We've been hearing a little bit about collaboration. Do you see a need for different players in the beef supply chain to work together more, or do you think there's a limit to how much the industry can collaborate?
Yeah, so like I've been preaching all along, I don't think there's any limit. I think the closer the collaboration is, the better the end result will be for a Canadian consumer. I can tell you that spending days and days and days traveling the country, visiting small producers, visiting packers, visiting cutters has been eye-opening for us, and has allowed us to better share with the Canadian market what we want to share. Right now our relationship is extremely strong with our cutters. I'd say it's okay with producers and with packers. We have to expand on that relationship and get as close with producers and packers as we are with our cutters, and create longer lasting relationships that will in turn help the Canadian economy take advantage of this great Canadian beef product. So yeah, in short, my opinion is that there's no limit in what we can do, and we do have a long way to get to an excellent, 5-part relationship with producers, packers, cutters, restaurant, retail, and then the Canadian public.
Thank you. Bob, any thoughts on this question?
Absolutely, and Trystan just said it perfectly. The less collaboration along the supply chain we have, the more it hurts all of us, right from the producer to the consumer. I'm putting on my own personal hat and taking off the industry hat, and we're actually building at home a supply chain ourselves, because we believe that is the future, and it's based completely on communication, knowing what Trystan wants and what we can produce, and figuring out a way to get that in between. And I believe that's the way the industry is going to move forward. It's going to be on communication. It's not going to be strictly on profit anymore.
Thanks, Bob. Jarrod, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think, the collaboration, as I mentioned there in the previous answer, right? I mean, I think that's an important piece, and it's that communication. How do we share? What do those best practices look like? As we look at making sure we tell the complete story, and making sure from a consumer standpoint they understand and they're confident in our system, I think that is critically important to make sure that entire supply chain is connected and they're educated about it. And I on the back of that framework and understanding what that looks like, and whether it be the Tait Family farm on more of a niche market with the consumers they're servicing, with the the larger scale operations where we're bringing beef into the Canadian consumers. I think the free market system definitely has a role into that, and making sure how do we understand what that flow looks like? I think is critically important for the consumers and across Canada.
Thanks, Jarrod. And Mary Jo, do you want to weigh in on this?
Sure. I think everyone's done an excellent job of answering this, and I totally agree. I don't think there's any limit on the collaboration and communication. And just to provide a little bit of a smaller perspective, from us working directly with restaurants and consumers, we have that opportunity where they can come back to the farm and kind of have that first glance of like, oh, okay, yeah, this is how things work. But also that communication for us has really become important when we are dealing with our local abattoir and having an understanding of exactly what a restaurant is looking for and exactly how they can cut it. And since they are a small abattoir in rural, southwestern Ontario, sometimes that means reaching out to other resources because it's not a typical cut that they would normally do. So it expands their horizons as well. And then comes around, they can now help 10 other farmers who are doing what we're doing too, to try and move their product in the same kind of cutting fashion and that sort of thing. So, and all that is excellent for the industry as a whole, whether you're a small farmer like us, whether you're a feedlot operator, it all helps to build that profile. So I definitely agree with everyone. And something as a beef producer, we talk a fair bit about our operation because folks want to understand, how did you set up your own, as Bob said, your own kind of supply chain. And we're open book about it because there's so many amazing farmers out there, and the more of us that work together at telling our story, whether it's from directly to the person who's going to buy the steak right in front of us, or to someone who's going to go and pick it up at the grocery store as being processed by a packer, that's positive. So speaking better together through farmers and then all through each other is all, there's no limit on that at all.
Great, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts there. So Jarrod, I'm going to pitch this one at you first. So what are the major takeaways and key learnings your business had due to the COVID-19 disruptions this year?
Yeah, I think, obviously, it was significant, as I mentioned earlier, right? And you think of what COVID's done, and it's really looked at the strength and the relevance of Cargill's values, and do the right thing, put our people first, and figure out how to reach higher. In defining that in a pandemic is pretty tough, right? I mean, because there's, as we manage through that, there's a lot of difficult discussions. There was a lot of difficult conversations being had. I mean, as you think of the suppliers, I mean, obviously we had to take a stance where we took one of our facilities down there, specifically in High River, and the Guelph, Ontario facility has been able to produce through COVID with minimal to no interruptions. But in High River, there was a greater one, and the impact on the producers, we knew the difficulty of that, but we also know, as we look at our employees and putting them first, that is what we do every day, and in figuring out how to do that. So being able to come back from that, we are, as I mentioned earlier, we're at 100% capacity at this point in time, and proud of what the team's done. It's also demonstrated what the strength of those relationships look like, and whether it be the customers, our direct customers that are serving consumers, the conversations that came back up to that, and largely from a media standpoint, that's untold, right? I mean, it's untold what our employees, how they truly felt about it. It's untold what that, from a customer or consumer standpoint. I mean, you definitely heard one side of the story, and we wish that probably we had that other side told, and we're really, really proud of that. And the support, the support that's come back out of that. I think for us too, it's increased the confidence in the food safety system, right? So how do we make sure that we can bring that through? What does that look like? What does the contingency look like as we work through those things? I think, the way we manage through them, while definitely not perfect, I think there was a lot of learnings along the way, and stuff that we've definitely taken away from that. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, it's that the essential part of what we do every day, right? And starting with the producers and the ranchers, all the way through to the consumers and everybody in between. It amazed us how many letters and conversations that we had from a producer group that came back into our facilities. I mean, there's, Alberta Beef put a video together that's played there in High River thanking our employees for coming to work and thanking our employees for what they do and what they're being faced with. So truly, as I think about the learnings, it does go back to the communication. It goes back to the collaboration. And, from a supply chain standpoint, none of us can stand alone. It takes all of us working together. And I think that's a critical component of what we did through COVID-19. Obviously, looking back, there's things that I definitely would say we would do different or do better. But I'm also really proud of what our team did and then, broader across the industry.
Thanks, Jarrod. Trystan, I'll throw this one your way now. What were the major takeaways that you learned during this pandemic?
Yeah, so we learned a lot. We learned a lot about ourselves. We learned a lot about our teams, and we learned a lot about people. I've kind of summarized it in four short points here that I'll share with the group. So number one, status quo is no longer good enough. Everybody has to adapt and everybody has to change. Taking risks is paramount, and making sure that you get out of your comfort zone is very important. Making mistakes is also important, and we've made a few, and adapting quickly. So those are kind of the four leading principles that we've gone by over the past 4-ish months, and they've led us in the right direction. And the reason why I say make mistakes, because some people may be going, well, making mistakes is a bad thing. Well, if you're not making mistakes, you're likely not taking enough risk. And the ability to adapt quick and to change what you've done is paramount and key in making sure that you're doing what's right for your guests and what's right for your team, which is the two most important pieces of our business: is a happy team and guests that love coming back to shop over and over again.
Thanks, Trystan. Wouldn't it be a wonderful world if we could take risks without ever having to worry about making mistakes? It just doesn't quite seem to work like that. Mary Jo, I'll toss this one your way now. Do you have any thoughts on key learnings for your business?
Yeah, for sure. I think one of the main things is we learned how quickly we could pivot. So as I said before, everything was going straight to restaurants that effectively, middle week in March here in Ontario, that was all closed. And we had set that up that our consistent supply with restaurants and wholesale customers was covering our minimum bills. So suddenly when you lose that, my husband and I both looked at each other and like, okay, what are we going to do? And we completely switched everything. So the fact that, you have to have faith in yourself and in the decisions that you're making. And like Trystan said, at the end of the day, we're like, well, if it doesn't work out, we're going to try something else. We'll just try to put something else together and make it work. So we learned how quickly we could adapt, and then how much faith we needed to have in ourselves, because we had been trying. Right now we're moving mostly online as opposed to people coming to the farm and buying, because we were shut down for a little bit. And we learned that it was very easy to make that switch, and that we needed to have faith in something that we had tried to establish for a very long time, and had always kept it sort of in the back burner and got 1 to 2 orders a week, that sort of thing. And quickly now, suddenly this is our primary role. As restaurants have started to open back up, now we're starting to shift to be able to try and meet both demands. And that's going to change for us. I mean, we talked about our 5-year business plan this morning, and we're like, we can't even plan for 2 weeks from now, let alone for 5 years. So that's a little bit difficult for us. Other than that, I think the major takeaway has just been, that we are so lucky to have such a great support system in each other, and people are there to reach out. So we had multiple farmers in our area who had loads of cattle sitting because they couldn't get into a plant somewhere, contacting us to say, can you help me find a home for at least a couple, so I've got something coming in. And then we had great action from our local association and even our Ontario Beef Farmers of Ontario as well. So it was really interesting to live through something, that I hope we'll never live through this again in our lifetime, but definitely I've never experienced anything like this, and see how everyone really puts it on, like, okay, let's work together and let's figure this out. All the while you still got to do all the chores and deal with the kids and everything else. So some of the major takeaways has just been, having faith in yourself and in your industry and in those around you to reach out when you need help.
Thanks, Mary Jo. And I think that's a really important point, being able to support each other actually as well. And Bob, what are your thoughts on key learnings for your business in particular?
I think everybody's about said it. You know, I sat and we're only about 19 miles from the Cargill plant in High River. And we got to watch pretty closely on what Cargill actually did. Don't want this to sound like a Cargill commercial, but what they actually did inside that plant and how fast they got it done to protect their employees, you know, and everybody said it, the speed of being able to change. And the other thing from my perspective, from a feedlot perspective, is last fall, if you were producing protein, 2020 was going to be a wonderful year. And I think a lot of people kind of maybe neglected their risk management strategies a little bit because all the stars were lining up. And then there was a little bug came along. And I think the biggest takeaway to me is just make sure as producers, as feedlot operators, primary producers, that you have some sort of risk management plans in place, some way to move some of the risk onto somebody else or somewhere else. I think that's the number one thing.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, that's a great point because 2020 did really seem like the year for the beef industry, and then a big storm blew in. So Mary Jo, I think for this final question, I'll toss this your way first. Do you have any thoughts from what you've seen on how the pandemic has changed public perceptions about the beef industry?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, my experience is very local to our area, and especially, you know, dealing with a much small consumer base. But definitely I saw a shift in March where it went from, I just want whatever I can, you know, whatever I can find wherever, to, you know, I can't even find what I want on the shelves. So I want to go somewhere that's reliable, and that's my local people. So I did see that, and I even saw it on some of our local, you know, buy sell pages and whatnot, people commenting on the local grocery store and whether they had Canadian beef and that sort of thing. So I saw that shift less from being more questioning to more, you know, I have faith and I have support, and that was positive for me. And I really hope, that's what I hope continues through all of this, is that people can have that faith from the very beginning all the way to whether they're getting it in the grocery store, on a plate in a wonderful restaurant, or from their local farmer. And that has been excellent, in the fact that they have had that faith, and I really hope that that continues.
Thank you. Trystan, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest. I'm not certain, and I would consider myself part of the public, and I don't think it's changed the perception too negatively. I think, you know, some of the media around some of the closures of the plants in Alberta lasted maybe a week, and then there was something new to talk about. So I don't think from a public perception that was too detrimental to the future of Canadian beef. So no, I don't think that the public perception has changed dramatically over the past 4 months, in my opinion.
Thanks, Trystan. Yeah, you know, it is hard to know for sure because we're also not getting out as much and talking to people as, I mean, there's social media, but I don't know if you only tend to connect with a certain swath of people that way. Bob, have you noticed, do you have any observations on whether public perception has changed?
I agree with Trystan entirely. If anything, it's improved, I think. I think we've got the movable middle. And what I saw on news reports and things like that was when the run came on grocery stores, when they went to the meat counter, the beef was all sold out before anything else, which means that the movable middle still likes beef. And I think that's where we've got to concentrate our efforts and make sure they keep liking beef. And through what we've discussed before is how that's going to happen, in my opinion. But I don't think that there's been a whole lot of negativity come out of this.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, and that's a good point as well about the buying of beef early on in this. Jarrod, last word goes to you on this question. Have you observed any changes in public perception or have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, obviously, and it was mentioned, I mean, several folks have mentioned it, what we saw around High River, and I mentioned it a second ago too, right? From a media standpoint, I mean, there was a lot of the conversation that went untold. Fortunately, I guess that, Trystan, it probably appeared shorter to Trystan than it did to me, to be honest with you. It felt like a drug in the news for a long time, being in the heart of it. But ultimately, coming out of it, I think, Bob's point's right too. And you look at demand, and you look at what was being asked, and you look at the shift in the retailers and how we were able to fill that in. And ultimately, from a producer standpoint, what that flow looked like and how we handled that. And I think the education, there was a lot of conversations occurring. And I believe even though there was times where they were a little bit in the background, I think we've brought them forward. And I think that has been very advantageous for the beef industry. So, as we think of the panel and the producers that are listening and participating in this, ultimately they are that gap. They are that stopping point that starts all this. And I'm really proud of what they've done to be able to help us maintain a system that flows through. And I think that's a lot of work, and it probably goes, it goes untold. And there's a lot of work in the background to truly make this industry work. And we're really proud to be a part of it. And, through our employees and what they've done and the support, like I mentioned earlier, that's come through to that. So ultimately, I think there was a bit of an opportunity on a story or two, probably. But again, I think as an industry, I'm really proud of where we're at and where we're headed.
Thanks, Jarrod. And yeah, that's a great point about all the work that goes on almost behind the scenes that a lot of people don't think about, whether it's your employees or folks in feedlots or beef producers. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for weighing in today. It's been a very interesting panel discussion, and I was just thinking it would be quite interesting to reconvene this panel in a year and see what our perspectives are on a year, because really we're still in the middle of all this. So yeah, it's very interesting times. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this panel on building resiliency in the beef industry, and have a great evening. Thanks.
Thank you,
Lisa.